Good morning, everyone. My name's Jodie. I work for Regen. I'm our head of community and local energy at Regen, and I've been working there for about 8 years with community energy organisations across the country. I'm delighted to welcome you to this forum on network charging for communities with Northern Powergrid. This is part of a series of work that we've been doing with Northern Powergrid to help communities engage in the clean energy transition, to get up to speed with what's happening as that transition happens, as we work towards net zero, and to ensure that that transition is as democratic and decentralised and decarbonised as possible. The aims of this session is for new and existing community energy organisations and climate action organisations, and it's about helping you understand more about how we pay for our electricity network. It's been one of the key barriers nationally for community energy in terms of connecting new low carbon generation. So if communities want to do renewable energy projects, paying for that connection has been quite a significant barrier over the years. And we want to change that. And we're delighted to say that Ofgem has been working towards this, our energy regulator, with the industry for several years now. So changing how we pay for that network to enable the net zero transition to happen. Today, we will be having lots of discussion about that. We've got key experts in the virtual Zoom room with us who are going to explain to you some of those changes and what they might actually mean for you. And then we'll also be summarising those changes, the proposals for the changes, and writing those down, sending them off to Ofgem as a community response to their minded to proposals on access and forward-looking charges. We'll be also asking for your feedback at the end, to work out whether this has been useful to you. And yeah, if you can hang on for the end and make sure you fill that feedback in, that's really helpful for us because it helps us shape how we work with you in the future. We're going to introduce you to our team today, but if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be brilliant. We won't have time to go around everyone and introduce everyone personally, but we're going to just introduce ourselves on this team as we've been organising. So I'm going to pass over to Anda first of all.
Thank you, Jodie, and good morning, everyone. Really pleased you've been able to join us this morning on this very complex yet exciting topic, and hope the session is useful for you. I'm also listening in to find more about it. Always keen to kind of learn more about the complexities of the changes in the regulation and how we can work with them to make sure they work for everyone. But my name is Anda Baumann. I'm Community Energy Lead for Northern Powergrid. Last year, we engaged with more than 3,000 community energy representatives and different stakeholders with an interest in community energy. And we set up a community energy stakeholder panel. And through all of that, we felt that connections is a really kind of key topic of interest. In fact, that was the first topic that our panel elected and wanted to discuss with us. And our colleagues joined for that discussion as they are joining today, as we found that where this policy is changing significantly, and we kind of committed that we need to explain where that policy or those policy proposals are going and what it might mean. So hopefully today's event is a useful resource for you now, and perhaps if you're watching this as a recording, it's also useful. And I'm hoping we get a good discussion today about all things connections and community energy. Pass back to Jodie.
Thanks, Anda. I'm going to let Peter introduce himself. Need to unmute Peter.
Yes, I'll unmute myself first, yes. Peter Turner, I'm the commercial manager responsible for connections and agreements. What that means in sort of reality to what we're going to discuss today is I'm on the connection boundary group with other DNOs and Ofgem. I manage the company's connection charging methodology. I've been involved in drafting the what we call the second comer regulations, which I consulted on. So all things sort of connections related, plus a few others, but specifically for this, and I'm filling in for my colleague on access. Over to you, Jodie. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Gavin, would you like to say hi? No. Okay. Poppy.
Hello, I'm Poppy. I'm the head of cities and regions at Regen, and also the lead on network charging. So I've been involved in this process and sitting on the challenge group for 3 to 4 years during my time at Regen. So I know lots of stuff, probably not as much as Peter though. So I'll be giving Regen's perspective on some of the changes coming out of this, but it'd be really interesting to hear from Peter from the other side.
Thanks, Poppy. Kai?
Hi everyone, I'm Kai Hoare. I work alongside Jodie in our community energy team at Regen. I am here today to help capture everyone's feedback, so I'll be scribbling away furiously. And if anyone has any tech issues as we go forward this morning, then do let me know. But hopefully everything runs smoothly. And yeah, looking forward to hearing all of your feedback on these really exciting changes.
Thanks, Kai. So true to form, some housekeeping to go through with you. We will of course send you all of the slides that we show you today, so don't feel like you need to scribble furiously. We are recording, as Amanda said, so this is to make sure that anyone who can't attend today, given that we are in the middle of a holiday season in August, they can watch later and catch up on some of this content. Please use the chat function and ask questions as much as possible. You know, this session has been arranged to enable you to learn more about this topic, and we want you to tell us if you don't understand something. So don't feel afraid. I'm going to try and put a ban on any acronyms, make sure that our presenters are speaking in as plain English as possible, because this is a very technical topic. But if you don't understand anything, please do post that in the chat. Ask your questions, use the raise hand function on Zoom so that I can see if you need to ask a question. And yeah, use this as much as you can. You know, we've got these two experts in the room who are going to help guide you through this topic, and we really want to make sure this is as useful to you as possible. The consultation that we're talking about on this Minded To proposal closes on the 25th of August, which is next Wednesday. You are of course welcome to submit your own responses to that should you wish. I think, you know, Regen will be submitting a response to this. Northern Powergrid are also submitting a response and another response on behalf of this sector. And I think Community Energy England as well, Philip is probably going to be working towards a response on this. Philip, is that correct?
Yeah, it's kind of a slightly awkward time with staff holidays, but yes, we will be doing something, probably not as long as we might usually do, but yes, we will.
Thanks, Philip. So yeah, as I say, make the most of this session. Please ask the questions, and yeah, hopefully it will be enjoyable and you'll learn something today. Poppy, we're going to start with you and a bit of an introduction to this topic.
Yes, thanks, Jodie. So I'm going to just set the scene and get your minds into the right place to try and understand some of the things that Peter's going to be going through. So just on to the first slide. The first thing I wanted just to flag, this may just be revision for some of you, but is to think about the electricity system and just be aware of what part we're talking about and how this relates to other parts of the system. So this is just a little diagram to show that a lot of these discussions will be about charging on the distribution network. So that is the network that Northern Powergrid run, and that under distribution there are a lot of different voltage levels, and you go from a voltage level at a sort of household level, which is low voltage, all the way up to the grid supply point. And as you go up that line, these voltages get higher, and these are different voltage levels. There is also a big transmission system, which is the voltage levels above distribution, which transport electricity around the country, and that's run by National Grid, and big power stations and very big demand use that system, which is a slightly different system to the distribution network. So it was just to flag to you, this will be really important when we're talking about the connection boundary discussions, which Peter's going to introduce later. The next thing to flag would be about money. So bearing in mind the electricity system, this is just an assessment of a typical domestic bill. And under this, you can see that you will be paying already around 20% of your bill will be going towards network costs. So that is really important, because although it is just paying money, we think as Regen that what you pay, who pays, how they pay is really important to how these systems develop and how the distribution system develops in the future. So it's not just about money, but it's about how this whole system is going to develop to support net zero, because money talks. So there are three different parts of your network costs. There is the money you pay towards TNUoS, or the transmission network, which I noted above, which is the really big stuff. Around 6% of your bill goes to them. There is money going towards the national grid ESO, the electricity system operator, to keep demand and supply in balance. And that is your balancing cost, which is BSUOS in the acronyms here. And that's around 4%. And then around 10% of your network costs is through BSDUOS. So that is the money that goes to people like Northern Powergrid to operate, maintain, and improve the distribution networks. This varies, obviously, as you go around the country, but this is a sort of typical UK bill. So the next part is just to introduce the idea of these significant code review and why it's been launched. So they launched this in around 2017, and their main objective, Ofgem's objective, was to look at how we pay for electricity networks and ensure that the charging structure that they've got at the moment supports efficient and flexible use of the network, while supporting the UK's transition to zero carbon and at least cost. So importantly here, we've got this sort of I guess, tension between supporting net zero and supporting that at least cost. And that's what I guess is sort of overarching in Ofgem's mind when they were thinking about this review. Just as a note of interest, it's called a significant code review because there are codes which set out the methodology for how the charges are put together. It sounds very, very exciting, but essentially it's just a big change to the codes that set out the methodology for charging, hence significant code review. You can change it incrementally, so small changes to these codes happen, these code modification processes happen over time. But when they do something really big like this, they called it an SCR, significant code review. So when they were looking at these charges for the networks, they decided to break up the charges into two different types of charges, and they called these the access or the forward-looking charges and the residual charges. And the difference between these is essentially, for access and forward-looking, these are essentially, although you could challenge that, but these are the costs you can change, you can influence by behaving differently on the network. And the residual charges are the costs you can't change. So these are the costs probably of the network that already exists, maintaining that. And they launched, in fact, 2 significant code reviews looking at these different types of cost, of network cost. So that you may have heard of the targeted charging review. That was the residual charges, and that's sort of been through, the decisions have been made on that. And they wanted to make sure that everyone paid for the network fairly. And this is part of the access SCR that we're talking about today. So these are in theory the costs you can change, and that would be costs associated with connecting to the network. And then there was another part of the review which was looking at the ongoing costs, so how they could use these network charges to change people's behavior on the network. And just to note that that part of review that sort of changed to how you pay DUOS as a user who's already connected has not been announced yet. They still have an objective to announce that part, the sort of forward-looking charges, part of the review, but this is mainly about access, about the costs of connecting to it, although there were a couple of elements that dealt with forward-looking charges as well, just to confuse everybody. So I hope that's clear, but we'll stop after the next slide and you can ask me questions if that's not. And then the next one is just, I think, before Peter kicks off, and he might reiterate some of this. So we think as Regen, the most important part of this review for community energy groups could be about the connection boundary, about the access, about how much cost or how much individual projects, individual users pay towards reinforcement that they may trigger on the distribution network. So I'm going to try and explain. So we've got a quick explainer here about the difference between a shallow connection charge and a shallowish connection charge. And these are the ones that exist on the energy system at the moment. So a shallow connection boundary means that the customer really only pays for their sole use assets to connect to the network. So that's just the wire that goes to the network from your project. That can still be quite a significant amount of money, but essentially you only pay for that, and then any further sort of impact on the network, any reinforcement as a result of your connection will be covered by network charges. So you wouldn't pay that directly. And just interestingly, and this part of why this was launched was because that is the current arrangement on the transition network. So people like Hinkley Point C, they pay for their sole use asset, still quite a lot, but all the reinforcement that has been required on the transmission network as a result of their connection has been socialized and paid by all the users of the energy system. On the distribution system, there's a different way of charging, and it's called shallowish. And on your if you want to connect to the distribution network, you pay for your sole use assets, and you pay for a proportion of your impact on the network. So any reinforcement or upgrades that are required to the distribution network, if you want to put in some renewable generation, or if you want to put in a big EV charger. So not everyone will trigger reinforcement costs, but if you did, if you're in a constrained area, you would pay a proportion of the reinforcement cost at the voltage level of your connection. So if you connect to LV, you would pay if you triggered a reinforcement required on that substation, and you would pay a proportion of the cost at the voltage level above your connection. So if that then had a knock-on effect to the 11 kV system or something like that. And that is the arrangement at the moment for both generation and demand customers on the distribution network. And part of what Regen feel obviously is that this is sort of unfair to have different systems across the different levels of the distribution and transmission, but also really importantly, we think it causes a really significant barrier to new renewable generation and new demand on the distribution network. So sometimes these reinforcement costs can be minimal and not a big thing, but sometimes they can be really, really big. And that essentially halts the development of that project. So I'm going to hand, well, I might, do we open up for questions quickly, Jodie? And then we can hand over to Peter.
Yeah, so if you have any questions on that, please do raise your hand so that I can see you. There's a Zoom function that you can raise your hand. So essentially what Poppy's saying there is, you know, we're all paying for transmission level connections, but if you happen to trigger a reinforcement on the distribution at a distribution level, you're paying for more of the cost of reinforcement, and that disproportionately affects renewables and favours fossil fuels. And it also disproportionately affects communities, because communities tend to be the last in an area to connect, because communities take longer to connect to their projects. And by that point, often the capacity is gone. So we can see Richard and then Bill. So we're going to take a question from Richard and a question from Bill.
Thanks. Yeah, I was wanted to ask if there is an agreed formula for calculating these costs, if it's all sort of transparent and agreed with Ofgem or whatever, or if it's just up to the distribution network to sort of to give you a price, and how transparent that is, because it sounds a little bit Section 106-y. Do people know what I mean by Section 106, which is the sort of the planning charge where you basically say, I want to build a load of houses, I'm not going to build a park, I'm not going to build a school, I'm not going to build any shops or anything like that, but I'll give the council, and the council says, okay, well, in order to do all that stuff, you know, you pay us whatever, 60, 70,000 pounds, and we might build a school, or we might just put the money to whatever else we want to do. And it's kind of a bit like it's a bit shady, some of that. So I'm not saying that that's what's happening here, but I'm just asking, how is that calculated?
I think Peter's probably the best person to answer that question.
Yes. Thanks, Poppy. Yeah, happy to answer that one. There's a document called the Common Connection Charging Methodology, and everything gets an acronym, so it's the CCCM, right? And it's the methodology for calculating connection charges. Now, by methodology, it isn't a case of, you know, that it will relate to any sort of pounds or pence, because obviously that would be anti-competitive, and we're all very
price list
with that. But it's a method. So, for example, if I give you some straightforward examples, by the way, every DNO will have that document on their website, every single one of them, right? And it's I'll try and be, we can happily discuss it offline, but I'll try and be quick and hopefully answer your question. The document actually has 8 sections, right? But the one I mentioned, which is section 5, is governed ultimately by Ofgem, and it's a license requirement that distributors have to comply with it. So a couple of things just quickly. Extension assets, which are just the ones solely to provide connection to say your house or wherever you are now, you know, those are charged in full, right? But currently, reinforcement, making parts of the network bigger to add, say, capacity, there's a formula for calculating the apportionment, which is also common across all DNOs. Now, IDNOs aren't required to comply. Independent distributors, sorry, I'll slip into acronyms and stop us, but independent DNOs aren't required to comply with the common methodology, but from memory, I think most of them do align themselves with it. I'm conscious. I'm happy to answer questions on boundary, but I'm conscious I'm literally about to do access and then boundary later.
Yeah, so we will cover that in a bit more detail.
We can cover that. I guess the point is that there's a methodology that tells you how much you pay, the proportions of that is recharged, but essentially the total cost of that is the decision of the network as based on their network analysis. So there is always part of that might be challengeable. Conversations could be had to do something cheaper. There's also part of the cost that they will quote you, but you could then get somebody else to deliver that, maybe at a lower cost. So there's a number of different ways of getting the cost change and the cost down.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bill Granger.
Hi, everyone. The question I got is a more general one. You said a phrase which is at the heart of what most of Ofgem looks at, and that is at least cost. So anything that's done has to be done at least cost, and that's usually at least cost to the consumer. Is there any scope for changing how that is interpreted in the net zero environment? Because we're looking for much bigger changes to the network. We're not looking at sort of organic growth here and there. The grid could have to triple in size over the net zero period. And just considering simple additional transformer here or that may not be the least cost in the transition to net zero overall. Is there any scope for looking at this phrase, which is the one that blocks most things, and that is at least cost?
Yes, I mean, that's a really good point. And we think the sort of wording has changed as they've gone through this review. And part of the changes to the review, we think are starting to get to the heart of that, which is the difference between the cost of small incremental changes, which is sort of what DNOs are almost required to do at the moment, project by project changes, And they believe that some of the changes that Peter will be talking about should not just change who pays, but then how the DNOs deal with strategic reinforcement and upgrades of the network. And we think that's the really crucial part, in that Ofgem believe that by making these changes, the future will be cheaper than it would be if we left the system as it is. So yeah, we think that's really critical part of this review, and pointing out that the least cost is actually the more economically efficient, which suggests that that would be more strategic investment by the networks. And that's what we'd be, as Regen, we'd be really, really keen to see.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question, and it kind of hits to the heart of what a lot of communities have been asking for a long time, when they get a connection offer that's so high that they can't build their project. And their response to that is, why can't you just reinforce the network? Because we know we're going to need more renewables. And networks for a long time have been bound by their inability to reinforce strategically because of that least cost consideration. So it's really picking to the root of that problem, and hopefully we're, yeah, like Poppy say,
it's the ultimate catch-22 essentially at the moment, and we're trying to break out of that.
Yeah, thanks. Chris.
Yes, thank you, Jodie. I wanted to ask a slightly different question, but it does relate very strongly to the point we've just been discussing ultimately. Can you give us a perspective on why Ofgem should regard the connection cost of Hinkley Point, for instance, into the transmission network as a, inverted commas, socialisable cost, whereas the cost of connecting a PV array locally is not? Both are generating power. Philosophically, I mean, the laws of physics say they're the same kind of beast. So why should one be treated differently to the other? What's their thinking around that? And then, of course, following that comes the argument of why should not the DNOs be able to invest at more risk? I understand that their pressures are related to consumer bills, but they ought to have the ability to invest, inverted commas, speculatively, which is really the core of what Bill is talking about. But in fact have that risk underwritten by government rather than by their bill revenue. That would seem to be a way through.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason that they launched this review was because they recognise now the disparity between the transmission and distribution network. So we think that's really important to keep pointing out. They haven't, we can go into the detail a bit later about why they haven't gone fully shallow as a suggestion for generation at the moment. I think the question, there is an issue about sort of strategic investment. The first question is whether Ofgem will let DNOs do strategic investment and take risk. And then the bigger question is another philosophical one, is about who then pays for that. Is it the shareholders of the owners of the DNOs, or is it through the bill? And there is a bit of a question there. These are regulated industries, so they are making profit and they have shareholders. They can theoretically take risk, but they can also recharge costs through the bill and not take that risk. And I think there is a bigger conversation and a bigger tension that is constantly going on between Ofgem and the DNOs about who should pay and who should take risk. And that's probably way above Peter and my pay grade to discuss. But it is, you know, we need to, it's a key question.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, just I think we're in danger of going into the later session on boundary, but a couple of points. The thing with in terms of the least cost, and I notice that gentleman says the least cost to the consumer, right? Because I tend to have the connections sort of hat on all the time, and one of my colleagues has the user system sort of hat on, right? You can get a connecting customer, which could be a developer, and you could get a connection customer where, say Kai just randomly builds himself a house somewhere nice, and he's going to be the owner occupier, and he's going to pay his electricity bill, and that electricity bill will have user system in it. Kai won't pay user system to his distributor. So is it the least cost to Kai as the consumer of electricity, or the least cost to the person who built his house for him? Do you get what I mean? That's probably a bad analogy, because the methodology in terms of the connecting cost, it's the least overall cost, not the least cost to the connectee. And again, as Poppy quite rightly said, I'll come to it later, but if you think of it, there's two types of income a DNO gets, right? A customer is either paying a connection charge, and then other people are paying use of system through their suppliers. If I lower the connection, if Ofgem, because it's fully regulated, you know, there's things we can decide to do within our license to do it, you know. So if Ofgem are minded to lower connection charges, you've got to think to yourself, where's that lowering of money going to be funded from? Now, the minded two proposals are virtually silent on what they're going to do with use of system, but it's got to come from use of system somehow. It's just the mechanics haven't been quite worked out. So it's that balance, you know. It's like a sliding scale in a way. Anyway, I'll pass on to you, Jodie. Thank you.
Well, it's you next, Peter, anyway. So
on a different subject.
We're slightly over time, but we're going to talk about network access rights now. So Peter's going to give us a run through of current and future arrangements for network access.
Thank you. Great. So as I say, I'll go through this, and I'm conscious this probably I'm down for 10 minutes. I don't think I've got that many slides, and then there's a sort of a roundtable discussion at the end of it. So as you're no doubt aware, Ofgem are consulting on what they always call minded to positions, which is exactly like it sounds. You know, they're seriously considering doing this, and then they're going out with consultation to stakeholders to get opinions. And what it is it's on distribution connection charging, which we'll cover later, definition of and choice of access rights, which we're going to cover now, and then there's transmission charges for small generators, which is another subject. Now, the consultation was published on the 30th of June. It has a deadline of next Wednesday, the 25th. I know Anders already sent the link round. That's the link to the consultation. There's the main consultation document, and there's 4 annexes. As I said, it's almost silent on any changes to use of system, what I'll call DUOS. I'm conscious of these acronyms, but a distribution use of system. So it's silent on those. Modelling work in 2021 has been suspended by Ofgem, and Ofgem's reaffirmed that the final decision in late 2021, which is targeted for December, won't set out the DUOS reform. So whereas in my world, if you reduce the connection charge, it goes on to DUOS, my colleague who handles DUOS doesn't know the specifics of where it will fall. Next slide, please. So just current arrangements. As I say, I'm not the network access expert. My colleague is, but I'll try and answer any questions. And if there's any I cannot answer, I'll take them away, no problem. So network access rights define the nature of users, and we use the term users, but you know, consumers, access to the network and the capacity they can use. So, for example, how much can they import or export, when and for how long, whether their access is to be interrupted, and then what happens if it is interrupted. So access, network access, it requires a connection from the user's equipment to the wider network. So from you to say our network or any DNO's network, and then allocated capacity on that wider network. So current arrangements mean that those users with what we might call a standard connection have a high level of firmness, a sort of a 24/7 arrangement, you know, which is generally only curtailed due to any necessary maintenance, network damage, or faults, you know. So if a DNO wanted to curtail one of these types of users, then the DNO would seek to agree a flexibility contract with that user. So it would be a mutual discussion with that user, you know, at such and such a time, would appreciate it if you could, you know, reduce your demand, and it would be by agreement. Next slide, please. So these minded to access rights reforms. So Ofgem, they're minded to introduce the following access right choices. I suppose I maybe should say that the minded to proposals are already based on quite a lot of industry work. So these are Ofgem's shortlisted options. So I've omitted all of the options they've decided not to include, because you can't do that in a 10-minute presentation, if you know what I mean. So these are alternatives to what I'm sort of calling your 24-hour access. So there's levels of firmness. So this will provide choices about the extent to which a user's access to the network can be reduced and their eligibility for compensation if it is restricted. And then the other alternative is time profiled access. Now this will provide choices other than the continuous year-round access, you know, e.g. peak or off-peak access. So there's an improved choice and definition of access rights, and it could help users to get a quicker and cheaper access to the network in line with their needs and by making better use of that existing network capacity. Now, improved user understanding of their network access conditions is important and will also improve their ability to provide flexible services. So on the one hand, you've got people doing maybe just getting a cheaper, quicker access, and then you might have other customers who are able to provide some sort of flexible service. Now, small users, as part of Ofgem's shortlisting decision, they've ruled out better defining small users' access rights and given them a choice, as they're concerned that some consumers could end up with inappropriate levels of access that don't meet their essential needs. Plus, the other thing is smaller users, and Ofgem do say this in their paper, smaller users, their access tends to be based on what their fuse size is. You know, your house, for example, it doesn't have a capacity assigned to it, but you'll have a fuse size at the cutout, you know. Next slide, please. So just going through the non-firm one. So Ofgem are going to improve the definition and choice of non-firm access at distribution to help support more efficient use and development of network capacity. That's one of the key drivers, as well as decarbonisation generally. Users will be able to choose what percentage of their total access rights are non-firm, and they're minded to make it a percentage. And it will be protected from the risk of DNOs exceeding the agreed level of curtailment. Due to ease of engagement and ability to reflect distribution connected users' needs, Ofgem are also considering defining the distribution non-firm access in relation to consumer outcomes that would deliver the most value, and they're proposing to measure the degree of curtailment, how much something's turned down, on the number of hours curtailed. So it's sort of consumer based, and it'll give a good understanding of the level of curtailment they would be exposed to, and allow them to make their own forecasts about the amount of energy imported or exported that would be curtailed. So it's driven a lot by the customer's needs, because they know, for example, their own business best. So that the proposed changes, they will not impact existing users' access rights. So as an existing, let's call it the 24/7 user, they won't change. If an existing user wanted to amend their access rights, then they can simply apply to the network operator through the normal process. You know. Next slide, please. So that was the non-firm. This is timed profiled. So proposing to introduce new timed profile access rights for demand and generation users. So time profiled access rights may help develop a more efficient electricity system if the users profile their access rights to move away from the network peak. So one of the network peaks is of a tea time. There you are today at, my colleagues know the times, but at sort of, if I say a tea time today, people come home, you know, you put the washing machine on, you go in the shower, you put the kettle on, the demand goes up domestically. Or you can argue other demands could go down, you know, offices might be, you know, shutting down for the weekend and whatever. So there's certain sort of relatively standard peaks and troughs on the network that you would try to avoid those sort of time periods. So the user would have to be flexible, and they would have to be able to be flexible about when they export or import onto the network to comply with their access rights. So they would shift that import export. Now, in comparison with non-firm access rights, the time profiled ones would provide those users with a greater certainty upfront about when they'll be able to import and export onto the network. So a user with time profiled access rights, they may have, say, a reduced level of access during network peak periods. Now, Ofgem consider that users should be able to agree, and that's a key point, agree that only a proportion of their access rights are time profiled. And the options are, they could request at certain times to have no access, a reduced access, or a non-firm access during peak periods. And as you can probably tell through this is an agreement. This would be a discussion with the network operator. Next slide, please. Right, and I'll just, yeah. So that have that discussion about this sort of access arrangement. Now, this is a new customer. Ultimately, and I'm going to go on to these questions. If as part of the discussion, that option didn't work out, they can just have a sort of a standard 24 access discussion. You know, I want X capacity, please, all the time. You know, they can still have that. That's a perfectly sort of day-to-day discussion network operators have. Right, so we're moving on to a round table. Do you want me to hand back to you, Jodie, just to go through these questions for customers, just to...
Thanks, Peter. Yeah. So we are going to have a bit of a discussion about these. The questions, as you can see, we'll leave those up so that you can carry on looking at those. But does anyone, there's a few questions in the chat that I can see. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask? You could raise your hand if you do. So Richard and Chris.
Yeah, so it's similar to the question asked in the chat. So yeah, I'm just trying to understand what you mean by a proportion of their access rights. So if you say, okay, for a certain amount of the time, I'm prepared to forego a proportion of my access rights. You're saying that you essentially you'd be reducing the capacity allocated. So you'd be saying, okay, I'm going to accept that I can't consume more than however many watts or how many amps at this during this period, or is it?
Yes, yeah. Again, I'm stressing minded to, because minded to is the sort of direction of travel, and the detailed mechanics will be worked out. But it is a percentage of time. So say it's me and you, Richard. I'll just make a number up. Say you've got a premises and it's got 5 MVA, 5,000 kilowatts roughly, right? Which you've applied for as a new connection, right? We'll park the existing applicant for now. So you're applying as a new connection, and I might say, well, at certain times, to give you 5 MVA, I'm going to have to reinforce the system, right? Which means make bits of it bigger. And I might say, well, to avoid that, I'm doing a very simple example. I might say, if you could avoid these peak times, I don't have to have reinforced the system. You'd have a defined percentage of time, and they are talking about time. And then what Ofgem are proposing is, so the benefit to you, depending on the type of connection, right? The benefit to you is, but today it's a lower connection charge because this is available today, right? What Ofgem are proposing is if say it was, I'll just make a number up with 80%. So I'm going to curtail you 80% of the time, Richard. If for some reason I needed to curtail you more than 80%, then what Ofgem are proposing is we agree some form of flexibility contract with you. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah. So even within bands of time, you'd still have a percentage of time of probability of curtailment within those sort of bands.
Well, as I say, those mechanics,
Right.
Those mechanics aren't established yet. All the proposals have said is a percentage of time, but it's the key point is they're trying to avoid peaks. What they're trying to do is that Ofgem are trying to avoid DNOs constantly reinforcing the system.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, thank you.
Poppy, do you want to respond on that one?
Yes. So I think there's just a couple of things to note. One of the things that exist at the moment, there are flexible connections at the moment, and quite a lot of them are sort of open-ended. So you can be constrained 100% of the time, and that's sort of written in the contract. So the way that Ofgem are proposing is this is a sort of iteration. These are the next stages for those open-ended contracts where there's more certainty for the connectees. So they've got perhaps closed-ended contracts that say you won't be constrained over this amount of time and you'll be compensated for anything above that. Or say if you're a demand customer that has a really big machine and but you don't have to run it between 5 and 7 in the evening, you could then have like that time profile that you wouldn't have that additional demand on at that time. So you can think about it from that perspective. One of the things that we are concerned about as Regen for this is that they could end up offering solar farms, say, great, you can connect as long as you only export between 5 and 7 in the evening, which is obviously no good for them. And that these things tend to be more valuable for flexible generators, fossil fuels, essentially. So we are slightly worried that these, particularly the time profiled, is likely to be mainly of benefit to fossil fuels, and it may actually be a problem for renewable generators. They could be offered silly things, you know, you can export wind farm when it's not windy type things. So so that is a bit of a concern. And just to note in the chat, obviously we'll talk about the shallow connection later, there is an intention that actually some of this could be the first step, that they do this for say 5 years in an area, and then that triggers a sort of strategic upgrade. So these could be short-term sort of requirements before they strategically invest. And just the final concern of Ofgem with the existing system where they had open-ended contracts was that it really undermined the market for flexibility. So they basically got their flexibility for free through these flexible contracts. And now this is hoping to sort of open up that they'll have to potentially procure, compensate, pay, and it might require more, you know, encourage more flexibility in users and also more procurement of flexibility by DNOs. So those are just a sort of quick run through of Regen's issues and concerns with some of this.
Yeah, and there is an advantage there, of course, as well. If you have more certainty of when you're going to be curtailed, it helps you with your financial modelling. It helps de-risk a project. So there's disadvantages and there's also some advantages in that.
Yes, sorry, Jodie, I went to all the bad stuff before.
It's human nature, isn't it, to go straight to difficult.
Just to chip in there, and thank you for that, Poppy. I'm just looking at the chat there, and Bill Granger's raised an interesting point. Surely non-24/7 access is only a temporary measure to enable connection before the network is upgraded. Clearly, net zero will result in massive expansion, so these access are actually irrelevant. It's an interesting point, that, and I suppose you've got, to my mind, you'd have two types of customer. Because if a customer we'll park the boundary for now, because as I go on to boundary later on, you'll realise the implications. Right? But if somebody says, like I was saying to Richard earlier on, you know, I can give you, say, for 5 MVA, I've got to reinforce, but I can give you 3 MVA before reinforcing. Then in that example, Richard might say, right, well, I'll manage with the 3. How long will the 5 take? Oh, that'll take this period of time. And then at some point in the future, on the Richard example, he then goes to the 5 MVA, right? But there's a
Can you just explain what MVA is for non-technical people, please?
It's roughly 1,000 kilowatts. 5 MVA, what is it? Yeah. 1 MVA used to be a decent sized supermarket. That's one of my very rough rules of thumb. So if you think
100 kilowatts.
1,000 kilowatts.
1,000 kilowatts.
Yeah, I think it would be easier if the pretended reactive power didn't exist for this purposes of this conversation.
Oh, I wasn't going to do barges and stuff like that, Richard, because yes, that's it. Yeah.
So communities will tend to be thinking about this in kilowatt and megawatt.
For the non-electrical engineers out there, right? Kilowatts don't equal kVA very often, but I'm just going to assume they do. So 1,000 kilowatts, very roughly a decent sized supermarket, right? But just Bill's point there, so yeah, you could get it where somebody says, well, I'll have the temporary connection, wait for the reinforcement, and then have the main one. Or you might get somebody else who says, well, I can actually manage with that that access option, and then I've avoided that reinforcement, because a lot of this is about avoiding sort of individual reinforcement driven by individual customers, and Poppy says it's about shifting it all towards a more strategic approach. And then just covering off Peter W's point, presumably increased solar power will favour daytime connections. If I do a yes and a no, yes, solar power is, you know, obviously it's a daytime sort of availability. And then the other side of it is to consider, I'm saying no, I don't mean no, I mean like pros and cons. If it's a 50 megawatt solar farm, right, it isn't anywhere near the town centre. It isn't anywhere near the demand, arguably. Somebody may be able to find one, but it'll be out in the countryside in a big farmer's field. So is there any demand there? And I'm deliberately saying 50,000 kilowatts. I'll use kilowatts. Absolutely massive. There's going to be little villages near there. They're not going to use that. So yes, the energy still gets exported, but it's all about balancing generation and demand. Because you do get and I'll close on this point, you do get generation-rich areas and demand-rich areas. So, but as I say, I mean, I'm happy to answer any questions, Jodie. Yeah. I put them up to give people an idea. I wasn't proposing to step through every one. It was just to give you an idea. This is what Ofgem are asking, you know. So the first question's on the non-firm option. Do you agree? Do you have comments? B is on the timed option, the same thing. Do you agree? Do you have comments? Shared access rights, which is C, is something they've discounted in the minded to. So that question's, look, we're minded to discount. It isn't shortlisted. Can you identify any benefits? How to reflect access rights in charges. We sort of covered that because from our point of view, you'd be getting a cheaper connection, you know. But given where it says AIE connection and/or distribution use of system charges, remember the minded to proposals are silent on distribution use of system charges. So it isn't going to happen for transmission. Think of it, this is purely a distribution review. Ofgem aren't proposing to review transmission arrangements that I'm aware of. Do you have any view on how access rates should be standardised across DNOs? That's the big consistency question. And then the implementation date.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Chris has been.
And I know what Peter said there. I know what Peter said there, and it's quite right what Peter says. Sorry, just to cover that off. They do feed into the general grid, but yeah, you've still got to sort of, when you said it would favour daytime connections, I suppose there's lots of factors in there. The size, you know, if you've got a big solar farm out of area, it's feeding into the grid, but it's feeding into the grid at, say, motorway level. And please tell me if my very bad analogies don't work, but the bigger the solar farm, for example, the sort of, you know, it might feed into a motorway. If you've got a smaller sort of solar farm, it will feed into that general grid and offset demand. Yes, exactly, yes. And then you've got battery storage and things like that, you know, and landfill and others. Anyway, over to you, Jodie. Sorry.
Chris, I'm just going to pick on Chris because he's had his hand up wanting to ask a question for a while. So I'm going to let Chris ask his question.
Thank you. I mean, I agree with Peter. We're not going into reactance theory today. It's far too hard. I really wanted to test my understanding of what's been said. Poppy hinted at some of it in her responses a while ago. Talking about time profiled access, if I understand correctly, this involves curtailment and or the ability to supply extra output. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a word for that. I suppose increment might be close enough. So let me see. If I'm a solar PV farm somewhere, I could negotiate a connection deal which allowed me to generate excess power or put a power into the grid and take power out of the grid. And I could optimize that negotiation if I use some storage of my own. I could store power at a time when the DNO would charge me a lot of money to feed that power into the grid, and I could release it into the grid later. I mean, leaving aside the question of what price I might get for it, and that's a slightly different question. So you could have a storage and generation small scale that could actually optimize its access and its economics into what it took from the grid and what it from the DNO and what it delivered to the DNO network. Is that correct, first of all, in principle?
I think the idea that projects would invest in flexibility, things like batteries, to allow them to have cheaper connections is absolutely what they are intending to do. So I think that is part of it. We would be sceptical about whether that would be sufficient.
Let me ask a slightly more complex question then. This having lots and lots of small storage capabilities scattered around all these individual PV arrays or whatever is probably not optimal from an engineering or an economics point of view. So the question is then, could a number of PV generation installations, small scale, somehow cooperate to produce a shared storage facility? Now that's...
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and that is where perhaps there's more benefit to shared access than they had originally intended. Because yes, it's interesting. Ofgem tend to be a little bit selective about what they think is efficient and inefficient. But you're right that having lots of, for solar farms, putting in small batteries behind the meter is actually a more inefficient energy system solution than having one big storage and flexibility asset in a particular area. But they don't seem to be, like I said, they can be selective about what's effective and what's efficient and what's not efficient. And but I think that's a really interesting example, and perhaps something you could put into your response as a sort of example of where shared access might add value.
But it means that.
But if you're thinking about wanting to install a big battery, really what you should be doing is lobbying your DNO to build that battery for you and sell it to you within the 5-year period that they have to get rid of it.
Is that within
Which
their
isn't
license?
within their license? Yeah.
They can.
Well, this is a key point, Jodie. In fact, what is the actual constraint of the DNO as a storage operator? What is the actual letter of the law here? Because I was kind of writing off this idea that if they could build it and lease it back or something, I mean, that's just an engineering contract. They're just actually building.
So as I understand it, they can, as I understand it, they can build it if no one else in the market is providing the flexibility they need in that area, but they have to then let go of that asset
you've
and
got to
sell it
prove the
on.
need for the flexibility, aren't you? So you're back to this investment argument again.
Yeah. So in theory, another solution, a more efficient solution, like you said, would be the DNO procuring flexibility in an area to be able to deal with that sort of lots of solar coming on at once in one area. But that doesn't happen at the moment, and that's part of the question about whether this will encourage more strategic investment and that sort of solution.
I suppose the other thing is, Chris.
Hold on. We're going way off topic here, so I'm going to draw it to a close there. It's 11 o'clock. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to go and get yourself a cup of tea, have a little break. I'm going to ask Kai to leave up those questions because we've had lots of questions from you guys about these questions from Ofgem. But what I'd like to see is some of your responses to that in the chat. So what you think about these proposals, what you would like Northern Powergrid to be advocating on your behalf would be really helpful. And we will meet back here at 11:07. Thanks, everyone. So welcome back, everyone. Hope you managed to go and find some nice snacks in your kitchens. Just if you can turn your camera on when you get back, that'd be really helpful. And does anyone have any kind of thoughts on access, consultation questions, general, do they support these proposals? Do they not support these proposals? What's your kind of overall thinking on that?
Well, I'll start then, if there's an awkward pause. I guess my first, like you were saying before, human nature, my first sort of concern is that, well, this opens up a lot of possibility for hugely increased sort of inequality. People, beggars not being able to be choosers and having to accept sort of lower access rights, more restricted and less firm connections. I don't know if this is going to be, I don't know to what extent this will affect people at the household level, if suppliers are going to start to get in on this, and perhaps there's some protection here that will mean that you don't end up with people accepting connections at a household level that are not firm or constrained, and that you'll end up with a sort of a new generation of fuel poverty coming from a non-firm connection. Have I got the wrong end of a stick there?
It's been ruled out for small users at the moment. So domestically, you're not able to take up these options. I mean, some people would like people to be able to, but at the moment, it's been ruled out for those particular issues.
Okay,
Chris.
Thank you, Bobby. I'm just intrigued by the interaction between this kind of demand and supply management and as you say, the micromanagement at the household level that, you know, internet-enabled devices and differential tariffs for the consumer would give you. I'm wondering which is the most effective mechanism and how the two actually interact. Seems to be quite a big system question. You could see the whole thing becoming very unstable. I've often speculated that 4 in the morning may become the new peak demand period, because everybody sets their dishwasher and their car charger and everything else because they all think, oh, no one else will want electricity at 4 in the morning. And you'll finish up with effectively the daytime peaks reversed. This seems to generate a lot of instability and would have a lot of commercial implications for people who had curtailment agreements. So there's something quite complex going on here, I think, that isn't properly explored.
Yeah, certainly we think the definition of peak and off-peak, at the moment they're thinking quite, 5 to 7 in the evening, which is what it's always been. But we do think in the future it will need to be more dynamic, sort of system responsive type contracts rather than ones that are, but at the moment the systems are not able to have contracts like that, but we would like to see those in the future, essentially.
If I negotiate a curtailment arrangement with the DNO and the economics of that are based on the current peak and off-peak patterns, if those patterns suddenly change, then that contract may not work and the whole architecture of the thing starts to become unstable. That's not good for anybody.
It's good for a lot of people, I think. There's a lot of middlemen and a lot of securitization and stuff that could potentially take place here, isn't there?
Okay. In the interest of time, we're just going to pause it there because we have got the next part of our forum to come, which is about connection charges. So if you're wanting to connect to new renewable energy plants, which is one of the questions from Peter in the chat, or if you're wanting to connect to new demand, low carbon technology like a battery or a heat pump or an electric vehicle. So we're going to talk about what the implications for that might be, the connection charging and how that might change. Peter, I'm not sure if Peter's back with us yet from his tea break, but hopefully he's there and he's going to talk us through this bit now. Peter, are you there? Great, okay, no Peter. Poppy, do you want to talk us through the basics of this then?
Okay.
put you on the spot.
I'm sure Peter is going to be here any second now. What I can do is I'll just talk through quickly what has happened in terms of the minded to decision. So Ofgem have decided, which we're very excited about, that they think the incremental upgrades that were as a result of this shallowish system has caused a huge barrier to some connectees, particularly to renewable generation. And they think it perpetuates a sort of inefficient investment in the network by the DNOs, which we would, but two things that we would very much agree with. So they have decided for demand customers on the distribution network to go to a shallow charge. So as we introduced at the beginning, that means that if you're a demand customer, if you're an EV charging hub, if you've got a heat pump, if you're a big customer that wants to electrify something, you will no longer have to pay for reinforcement that you might trigger on the network. You would only pay for your sole use assets. So you're going to be treated the same as Hinkley Point C, which we think is really good news. We've seen some sort of examples of these that have been processed by actually another DNO, so we're not going to show it to you, but it looks like where reinforcement has been triggered by demand, you could see about a 50% reduction in the cost of the connection for things like EV charging hubs and things like that. So we think that's a really significant cost, and that's really potentially positive. And the second bit, oh, Peter's here, is that they want to make generation shallower. So they were proposing to remove that charge of 1 voltage level above. And the big sort of headline on that is that it makes a really big difference to some projects, and it makes no difference at all to other projects, depending on where you have triggered reinforcement. So Peter is back, and so that was just a Regen 101, and I will hand back to Peter to get through his slides.
Thanks, Poppy.
Apologies, I sneaked out to take some calls. Right, connection boundary. So just going through this. So the connection boundary is the extent to which customers pay for their connection, including any reinforcement that might be required, right? So the connecting customer, right? Now then, you can see that little sort of diagram on the right-hand side, right? Which uses Ofgem terms, mainly Ofgem terms of deep towards shallow. So this is in relation to the person applying for the connection, right? So the current boundary is considered shallow-ish. That's a proper Ofgem term, right? And what that means is the connecting customer will pay the full cost of any extension assets. These are also known as sole use assets. So, for example, the cable which connects the network to your new premises. I'll just shift that chat function, right. They will also contribute towards any reinforcement costs required to provide that additional capacity using one of two cost apportionment factors, which, if you recall a question earlier on, which I think was from Richard, those cost apportionment factors are detailed in the common connection charging methodology, and the formulas are common across all DNOs. It's basically, let's say you wanted 200 kVA, and I've got to make, and ignore what a kVA is, just focus on the number. You want 200 kVA, and I've got to make the shared use distribution system 1,000. You pay 200 over 1,000, 20% of the cost. And the DNO via DUOS funds the remaining 80% in that simple example, right? Now, you will also pay the full cost of any transmission works where the connection requires this. These tend to be typically large generation. As Poppy said earlier, the way transmission works is their very sort of a rough parallel, they have something called attributable works, that's sort of sole use assets, and they have something called wider works, which is sort of reinforcement. So you pay the full cost of that, and currently there's something called the voltage rule. That's how it's known, and it's a license condition, and it's also in the common connection charging methodology. The connecting customer will not contribute towards any reinforcement costs at more than one voltage above the point of connection. So if you think of voltages going from low to high, you've got low voltage, which is what your house has. You've got 11,000 volts, which is what the estate you're sitting on has. Think of it in sort of my bad example of roads. So you've got low voltage, you've got 11, which is classed as high voltage. You've got 33,000, 66,000, 132,000. So if it causes reinforcement at more than one, you don't pay. Now, generators and generators only also face something called the high cost cap, which requires them to pay all reinforcement costs above £200 a kilowatt. So very simply, if you have a 100 kilowatt generator and it causes £30,000 worth of reinforcement, then all DNOs are required to go, there's 100 kilowatts times 200 is 20,000. So that £20,000 would be apportioned, cost apportioned, but the amount above 20, the 10,000 would be charged in full to that generation applicant. So if we just go to the next slide, I'll not go through the diagram, I'll just go to the next slide. All right, great. So Ofgem's proposed changes. The way I've laid this out, very simply, if you see the left-hand column, I've just called it funding. What will a customer fund? When I use the term customer, I mean connecting customer. And then underneath, what the DNOs will fund, and by DNO, it means use the system, charge to suppliers, and then charge to their customers. So just looking at the top one, they're proposing shallow for demand. In a sentence, shallow for demand means you will not pay any reinforcement costs at all, right? In a sentence. So you will continue to pay the full cost of any extension assets, those sole use ones. You won't pay anything towards reinforcement. Where the connection causes National Grid to do work, you will pay the full cost of those sort of sole use grid assets, right? And then as you can see underneath that, this means the DNOs via the general master US customers will pay the full cost of reinforcement costs. Now going to generation, Ofgem call this shallower, right? So full cost of extension assets remains unchanged. There's a reduced contribution towards any reinforcement costs which are required at the voltage of connection only. So whereas today it's you won't pay for more than one voltage, what Ofgem are proposing is you will only pay for reinforcement at the voltage you connect to the system. So if you connect to the system at high voltage, I won't use numbers, but it's say high voltage, you're connecting at high voltage and some high voltage reinforcement works required, you will contribute towards it using the current apportionment methods in the methodology, which also will remain unchanged. Those formulas won't change. My simple example of 200 over 1,000. Now, the high cost cap, which I mentioned before, I'm happy to go into detail on this if anybody wants. They're going to retain the high cost cap, but they're considering two different options, right? So you've got some reinforcement, and currently, if that reinforcement is more than one voltage above, you don't pay. So imagine that's just full stop. you do not have to consider the high cost cap. If it's more than 1 voltage, you do not pay. That's like today's rule, right? So the voltage rule takes precedent. But Ofgem are also considering reversing the precedent so that you would consider the high cost cap. So let's say you've got a job, you're connecting it at high voltage and the reinforcement is more than 1 voltage above that, what we would call extra high voltage, right? On that option, you would look at the high cost cap and then apply that. Now it's this whole £200 a kilowatt. If it didn't cost £200 a kilowatt, the high cost cap doesn't apply. So it's basically a precedent. So the current precedent is voltage rule. They're considering the other way around. The reason for the high cost cap, which I should have put in here, my apologies, it was to protect the general mass of DUOS customers from schemes which would require excessive reinforcement. So again, just looking at the sort of the DNO line on that, so that the DNO would contribute towards any reinforcement costs required at the voltage of connection. I've put that as the full cost of any reinforcement costs above the voltage of connection. Obviously, that would depend on which high cost cap rule they went for. I'm just trying to keep an eye on the chat.
Don't worry about the chat, Peter. We can pick that up.
I'll cover off that question later on because yes, I can definitely answer that one. Next slide, please. Right, this looked good on my screen. So when we say, as you see, there's sort of a yellowy colour. I'll just call it yellow and red. When I say socialised, that means the DNO funds it to the general mass of DUOS, and it's just meant to be a bit of an indication of all of these options. So as you go along the sort of, it's almost a bar graph. The left-hand bar is the current arrangement, which is the same for demand and generation. So the red is what you pay for, and the yellow is what the DNO pays for through DUOS. So you pay for any new connection assets, those Sorius assets, you pay towards reinforcement, and the DNO pays towards reinforcement. Now, going forward, there's going to be 2 different boundary arrangements, or rather, the minded to is. So for demand, you will only pay for the extension assets. DNO via DUOS pays for reinforcement. And then for generation, you will still contribute towards reinforcement, but at lower, not at lower voltages, at the voltage of connection rather than up to 1 voltage above. So if we just go to the next slide, please, let me see where I am on this. Right, so before we go on to them questions, I'll just come back, if I may, Jodie, and answer Chris's question there. How does this work if the connection is used for both demand and generation? Well, I did get asked this question a while ago with regards to battery storage, because with battery storage, it imports and it exports. So it takes electricity in and it puts electricity out, simply put, right? And the answer I gave, and I'm still happy with the answer I gave our designer, is whichever one of those import or export is creating the need for reinforcement is what you base it on. So again, Ofgem haven't confirmed this in terms of minded to, but the way I would see it working is, given the if you say you're a battery storage, if it was an import restriction which caused reinforcement, but the export wasn't constrained in any way, then the import, to my mind, wouldn't attract any reinforcement cost. And I'll come to Poppy next in a minute. But if it was what I call a generation-rich area, and it was the export from the battery which caused the reinforcement, then I would be saying you would contribute towards a generation reinforcement. Now there are further complexities I won't go into as to when the import's happening, when the export's happening, you could get a situation where both of them occur and stuff like this. So I've answered that question as sort of straightforward as I can. Poppy,
just to say, yes, that's their position, Peter. Yeah, demand will be treated as demand, and generation, the export will be treated as generation.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
So ultimately, in summary, what Peter's saying is that if you want to connect a new renewable generation to your network, you will pay less of the connection charge than you would have previously. If you want to connect a new demand system, so EVs, heat pumps, domestic level, you won't be paying, apart from the wire from your house or your property, the property you're connecting to the network. Martha, you've got a question and you've had some experience of this in terms of those connection charges disproportionately affecting your project.
I've got two questions. First of all, in the previous slide, that was quite a good one, Peter. Thank you for that. How does the socialized cost get paid for? You know, it's great news that we're all getting, these things will become cheaper for us, but where does the rest of the money come from?
An excellent question.
Yes, a good question, Martha. Thank you. Could we go to that slide just to get it on the screen? If you imagine that red bar above the diagram, which is just a dividing line between the header, right? If the left-hand side is, say Jodie, just because you happen to be on the screen, Jodie's putting together a connection project, right? She wants a connection. So on the left-hand side, there's Jodie wanting a connection. And on the right-hand side, there's user system funding, which DNOs get from what we tend to refer to as the general Massachusetts customers, all of our domestic, industrial, commercial customers, billed via suppliers, right? Now, the slider, the sort of hypothetical slider in the middle, right? If I move it towards Duos, then Jodie, in my example, would pay a higher connection charge, or what we call a deeper charge. So if I move it towards Jodie, it's shallowish in the diagram. And then if I move it towards shallow, more's funded from Duos. But what I was saying earlier on, it's really important, I think, that stakeholders appreciate that there are two sources of funding that a DNO has, right? And only two. If it's a connection charge, right, then the person applying for the connection pays that charge, right? And then all of us paying our electricity bills, we're funding user system. So when you make, say, demand shallower, that money comes from Duos. But the mechanisms, I mean, there's established mechanisms now, but the actual mechanisms going forward, Ofgem have put that stuff on hold.
So
did that answer your question, Mark?
Well, so basically, those of us who are rich enough to afford EV cars and heat pumps and are, drawing more electricity are going to be subsidized by extra charges on everyone else's bills, including people who can hardly afford to pay their bills at the moment.
Jodie, do you mind if I just jump in and just say something there? Because so just
you're right, Martha. Yes, Gavin.
Let me just put my camera on. There you go. You can see me. Yeah, Martha, as Jodie says, you're right. In theory, we could end up with perverse situations where richer communities take advantage of the subsidised cost to install renewable generation, and then poorer communities who, for whether or not it's geographical constraint, for whatever reason, are not able to take advantage and also couldn't afford the upfront asset cost, end up subsidising them through increased bills. So that obviously is perverse. So we are doing quite a lot of work around not just Northern Powergrid, but DNOs, the wider energy industry, people like Regen and others, doing quite a lot of work around how do we avoid that from happening? How do we create a system which is fair? How do we create a system which is equitable? You know, what does fair look like, etc., etc.? What are our priorities? We haven't got a conclusion yet because it's quite difficult to marry all of those different competing interests together in a way that we consider fair. But it is something we're working on. It's called, it's gone out of my head now. It's gone out of my head. Jodie, what's it called? I can't remember what it's called now.
Are you talking about the smart and fair work stream of open?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. So it's not, I don't lead on that, and our engagement team don't lead on that, but certainly Anda will know some bits and bobs about that as well. Jodie will know a lot about that from an external point of view, and we are trying to get a solution to that because you raise a very important point.
It's not just an important point though, and you're right, Martha. Like if you're affluent enough to afford a heat pump or an EV, you won't pay for any upstream reinforcement. You'll just pay for that connection. And you're right, everyone will end up paying for that connection. But let's not forget that if you are a large-scale fossil fuel generator and you are connecting to our transmission network, at the moment, we are all paying for that. So we're all paying for big fossil fuel assets to connect to our network. And yet, if we want to connect low carbon technologies, there is a barrier. So it's a really difficult area to unpick, really difficult to make it fair, like Gavin says. Poppy, you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise, so there's a question here, firstly about whole system value. So is this solution the best solution to provide what we need, which is increased uptake of renewable generation and low carbon technologies? And if we think this is one of the most economic ways to do that. If we don't do it this way, we will have to do it through a subsidy, which will also go on bill payers in a different form. So there's a question about, is this the most economic? And we think it potentially is. The other question is really about how this is done by DNOs. So if it carries on as an incremental system, so everyone who gets an EV in a road, they do a little bit of an upgrade to the substation, then another person comes along and a little bit of an upgrade to the substation. That's a very expensive way of supporting electrification of vehicles in that road. The idea is that this system, and the more you socialize that cost and require DNOs to invest strategically, they do, in theory, a cheaper, bigger upgrade on that network that covers everyone in that street. So although it does raise costs, the idea is that this new system should raise costs less than it would do if it was just done on the incremental basis. You also have to question, you have to sort of look to the future and see, is this the best way to do that? So there are the increase in bill is the absolute big question here, and there will be lots of people that say it's not worth it. But the main challenge to that is, how else should we do it, given that the existing system doesn't work and is unfair? And we could have a whole load of subsidies, but we would suggest that subsidies are actually more inefficient way of doing this and more costly than through these socializing these network charges.
Martha.
Sorry to, I mean, that's all. Thank you everyone for your replies, really useful. Another thing I just wanted to raise, so one of the issues in our community, we're a very small rural community of 70 houses, so we're tiny, and we're only on single phase here. So our renewable electricity scheme was not financially viable, partly because the grid connection costs were so high and the need to provide a 3-phase upgrade so that we could export electricity. But I'm looking at this thinking, if that from a strategic basis as a village, if individually enough people in the village got EVs and heat pumps and put pressure on our grid from the demand side, we would get a 3-phase upgrade without us having to pay that for our community generation scheme. You know what I mean? I mean, that's seems a bit sneaky, but There must be a way, there would be a way we could force that upgrade without paying for it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think there's certainly a question about whether demand and generation are actually very linked in terms of upgrades. And so often when you upgrade something, you actually release capacity for demand and generation. And I think that's probably something Peter knows a lot more about than me.
I was going to say, I'll have to sort of jump in there if you don't mind, because there's sort of a third boundary. Well, there is. If you talk about domestic,
We've lost you, Peter.
One of the issues, just to go back to our scheme that we were looking at, was the constraints locally, and there were limits.
There are currently totally different arrangements, right?
Peter, hold on, sorry.
If
Peter,
housing
your
estate,
connection is so
customer,
poor.
right?
Your connection,
I know. Yes.
Your connection is so poor that we can only hear about half of what you're saying.
Ah, right. Right. Apologies for that. I don't know what that's about. Can you hear? I've switched my camera off to improve the connection, and the connections. Anyway.
Yeah. Go for it.
If a domestic customer, I'll be really sort of quick. If a domestic customer gets a heat pump, a solar panel, right, and the DNO does not have to work on the service cable, the reinforcement is free of charge. That's today, right? Now, Martha's example was very interesting because that was going from single phase to three phase, right? Which means the service cable would have to be worked on. But if you, as I say, if it's one person on a housing estate who's getting solar panels and the substation needs to be made bigger, if there's nothing wrong with that service cable, it's in that common connection charging methodology, they will not pay towards reinforcement. And the other thing with Poppy saying about the current arrangements not being fair, personally, I think they are fair, but that's, you know, just opinions, you know. But it's very important. It's in the methodology, and if it helps anybody, it's paragraph 5.30 A and B. So that's today, and it's something called whole current metered. So it isn't just domestic; it's also small commercial.
Martha,
Was
does
any
that answer
other
your
questions anybody had?
So I'm just going to check that Martha had her questions answered.
So you're saying that today, if enough people in our village put extra demand requirements that required an upgrade to three phase, that would have to be done at no additional charge?
No, I'm not saying that, Martha, absolutely not. If it's not about how many people, it's about whether the DNO has to work on the service cable going into your premises, say, right? The actual cable that comes into your premise goes to a cutout and there's a meter above it, right? If the DNO doesn't have to do anything to it, and just say it was just yourself, right? There's certain engineering recommendations, but the equipment's highly likely to comply with that. You won't pay for reinforcement. But if you want to go from single phase to three phase, right, they do have to work on your service cable. So you may well be charged for the reinforcement. In Northern Powergrid, you would be charged if we had to change your service cable from single phase to three phase.
But is there a difference between the supply to a village versus the supply into a house? Because the three phase power is 2 fields down from our village, but the supply that comes into the village is single phase.
Yeah. That's, you see, that is reinforcement, unfortunately. And I appreciate where, you know, the village being single phase. Now, if you lived in an urban area, then, you know, you're living in an urban area and there's, I don't know, there's 200 other houses around you, right? It doesn't make a difference in that situation whether one house or 200 houses get equipment installed subject to certain standards. The key point is if the DNO, any DNO in the country, if they don't have to change that single phase service cable or do anything to it, that customer or all those customers do not pay anything towards reinforcement. That's been in for a few years now. It's one of the points we've raised with Ofgem, is that they've got these two boundary options, but they've still got this sort of third boundary option which exists now. The key point, the key difference with your situation is going from single phase to three phase. You know, so
there's quite a lot. There's quite a lot in the chat here. Sue has a similar issue of small community energy projects wanting to be able to connect and not having the ability to do that. More people asking about needing EV chargers in rural areas. If I can ask you to put your specific examples in the chat and be as specific as possible about those, we can use those examples in the consultation responses, because what we don't have enough of is that evidence that you are being disproportionately affected by these charges. We know anecdotally that that's true. So Martha, if you can write down, for example, the size of the project you wanted to install and what your connection offer cost was, and what would need to happen to reinforce. Same for you, Sue, if that's possible.
I'll email it through.
Brilliant, thank you. Philip, you've had your hand up for a while. Philip from Community Energy England.
Thanks. Just with your timing, it is on topic, but just if you want to move on, that's okay. It's not a desperate question. How are we?
That's fine. We've got a few minutes.
Thanks. So yeah, I just wanted to tie a few things together and ask about how the decision is made by the DNO about how the extent of the upgrade. So we've been talking about how when the need to upgrade the infrastructure is kind of hit, and one of the things in the consultation is that Ofgem realised that it's only the one person who tips you over the threshold that pays the cost, which one of the things they're trying to do is change that structure. But we've obviously been talking about larger net zero, the future kind of thing, and the way that the infrastructure will change combined with some flexibility stuff and things. And so I was just curious to know how, A, kind of whether the consultation will change it at all, but B, mainly kind of what's the decision-making process? Because if you do have someone that tips you over the threshold, and you've been talking about the lowest cost, which is relatively new to me in terms of how they're making the decision, but obviously a DNO then has to make a decision. So we've got a connection customer who wants to get X connection that tips us over the threshold we need to reinforce. How do they decide how much to reinforce? Because presumably DNOs are doing their future energy scenarios. There's planning for the number of EVs, the number of heat pumps, there's all this stuff that's coming in. But obviously you can't expect one, or maybe this is how it works and why it's so problematic, because you then do get a customer where they say, well, actually, we're going to reinforce a huge amount based on the need to go in and do the building work at this point. And that is then why it's so expensive. Or is it the case that a DNO is kind of, well, we'll just increase it a bit, and then that lasts for a little while, and it's almost kind of random how long that reinforcement lasts before another reinforcement is needed. And so I was kind of just wondering how, these projections of the future fit in with the decision-making process, and how, I'll stop. I'm rambling now.
I can answer that one, Philip. If I do a today option, right? As I said, this common connection charging methodology, and I'll sort of link to ours out with our communications people. There's something in it called the minimum scheme, right? Which is a page of A4, right? But what it effectively says is, and it's common for all DNOs, when you apply for your connection, I have to provide you with the least total cost, technically acceptable solution. So it has to technically work, and the total cost, so before applying any apportionment factors or high cost cap, right? If the total cost of one scheme is X and another option the designer looked at was a higher cost of Y, I have to base it on X. The lower cost, the lower total cost, right? And the methodology is a license requirement, right? Now, the methodology does, so if you wanted a connection, right, and your connection just means I've got to put the next size of transformer in, right, and I'm avoiding numbers, right, I've just got to put the next size in. Now, if our designer looks around and says, well, over the road I've got another connection, and further down I've got that connection, we can put in what's called an enhanced scheme, i.e. bigger assets than what are required, right, if we believe there's an actual use for them. But we aren't able, and we haven't got the allocated funds to speculatively invest in sort of areas, you know. Did that answer your question?
It does, yeah, thank you. But I get that it sounds like there just isn't the scope within the way that you need to operate to.
Sorry, my apologies. I didn't answer your question fully because you asked if it was going forward. My apologies. Sorry for interrupting you, but I have to say these things as I think of them nowadays. Going forward, because the Ofgem are proposing to remove reinforcement for demand and reduce it for generation, Ofgem's idea is DNOs then have more, I don't want to use the term flexibility because it tends to mean something else. They have the ability to look at things more strategically. So rather than just say, well, for Philip, I've got to make that substation bigger. But there's a load of work going on in his area of the world. So in theory, we can go and we can invest more money because we think the actual developments are going to materialize. But we are investing duos money. So we've got to really do it wisely because it's highly regulated. It's like a fixed amount and stuff like this, you know. So going forward, it is considered there'll be a more strategic view about how things will happen.
That's very useful, and it sounds like that's something then that the community energy organisations, being geographically restricted in that they have to stay where their project is located, it sounds like communicating that future demand so it feeds into DNOs how they think about the potential connection, that potential reinforcement that they need to make. It sounds like we need to make sure that process works well, so that in the new system, the voice or the kind of the needs of community energy are taken into account when any reinforcement is done. That I'm just kind of thinking of next steps, really, I guess, after this changes potentially come in. But anyway, thank you. That was very useful.
Poppy,
no problem. Jodie, was there any other questions?
We've got a question from Chris, and Poppy's had her hand up for a while, so I'm going to let Poppy respond, and then quick one from Chris, and then we're going to move on because we are running quickly out of time.
It was just to support Philip. We think that's an absolute crucial question for the next stage of, if this goes ahead, how is this going to work in DNOs? We think they've got quite a big transformational change to move from an incremental system into a strategic system, and there's an opportunity there for regions, local authorities and communities to be more part of that decision-making process in terms of strategic upgrade. And I would just flag one of the big problems that they have is, if you look at the upgrade to the Western Isles, the proposal in 2019 for the subsea cable there from SSE, that's a sort of microcosm of the issues that they have, in that was rejected by Ofgem because it had speculative headroom. And that's a key question for the future, and is that still going to be the case?
Thanks, Poppy. Chris?
Yes, thank you. I think Poppy has said most of it. The real problem here is the burden of solid proof that needs to be presented to Ofgem before they will believe in or support a DNO investment case. It is not sufficient to say, well, we expect a local movement or local campaign that will suddenly make a step change in the number of electric vehicles, for instance, that need charging. The DNOs seem to be constrained to work on, in the nicest possible way, conservative engineering projections, and that actually presents a severe risk to them. If suddenly that a region or a community or a lot of communities decide they suddenly want to change in a stepwise fashion, then the DNOs will be short-footed, and they're short-footed because of the rules that Ofgem apply to de-risking the investment. So it's not entirely their fault, and I agree with Poppy. This needs to be substantially looked at.
A good point, and I would echo that in terms of kind of lobbying. You know, they set the rules. The Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy set the rules for what Ofgem will do and will not, and their appetite to essentially enable DNOs to invest more strategically. So if you want that to happen, I know lots of you are doing this already, but meeting with your MPs, talking about these issues, encouraging them to be mandating that the rules enable the low carbon transition to happen, because as we've discussed in this call and on the chat, we can see lots of examples here of communities wanting to invest, wanting to develop new renewable energy projects, or develop car clubs, whatever it is that you're intending to do, and not being able to do that. And we really need that evidence to be able to support this submission.
It's this very narrow economic utility mindset that is the barrier.
Yeah, so I want to get a general kind of sense from you. I'm going to ask for some hand waving now. So, you know, I'm just going to pick on that first question. Do you agree with our proposals to remove the contribution to reinforcement for demand connections and reduce it for generation? Do you think there's arguments for going further? Should we have free connections for communities, for example? So do you agree that with these shallower charging for connection, do you agree with removing contributions for reinforcement for demand? And I'd like to see some hand waving of up here, yes, if you really agree, not so much if it's down here.
Just while you're checking that out, Jodie, when we use the term free, we don't really mean free, we mean GEOS funded.
Yeah, so everyone pays, not,
you know.
Yeah,
yes.
Sorry,
yes.
Thank you for correcting me on that, Peter. Great. Okay, and Philip has just posted some information on how to get your MP a bit more involved. You see lots of hands up. Bill, Sue, are they quick? Because we've got to cover a little bit more in this forum before we close. So Sue, is it a quick one? You're on mute.
Sorry, mine was just, I was just trying to get how to wave my hand higher or lower, to be fair. But yeah, if we can all approach our MPs, that's great. But if you're collating our combined information, then I would imagine that's obviously going to be more powerful. But we have got links to other organisations. So Community First Yorkshire, for example, would it be okay to get them to encourage more of the community groups that they're in contact with to give input to you as well?
Absolutely. The more input to this proposal, I would encourage them to submit their responses directly to Ofgem because of the time scales here. So if they've got examples of communities being hampered by these charges, then send the responses straight to Ofgem.
And could we have a community-friendly presentation or handouts or whatever that we could share? Electronically obviously would be best, so that we can help to get the message across.
So that's what this forum is for, and we send the
I think this would be quite too technical for the majority of the communities that I'm working with, certainly. It needs to be user friendly as much as possible. So plain English and as few points as clear. I mean, the graphs are great, but with the explanation on the side would be good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So if we had more time, we'd absolutely love to do that. And point absolutely taken that we've really tried in this to make it as plain English as we possibly can. Is a really technical topic, and that makes it very challenging. But we will absolutely take that on board for any future work we're doing of this nature. Peter, is it a quick one?
Yeah. It's just, if I was just going to close by saying I've made a few notes myself to clarify a few points which I'll send to you and Jodie. And I'm not proposing to go through all these questions. I just highlight them because there's 2 pages of these. If anybody has any questions after the call and think, oh, I wished I'd asked that, if they just get in touch with yourself or Gavin or whatever, you know, I can sort of try and answer that and clarify it if I haven't been clear, because I totally agree it's a massively complicated subject.
Brilliant, thank you. So we have a few minutes. Kai's very helpfully popped up the feedback poll in case any of you do have to rush off, but a few minutes just to cover the future direction of travel on transmission charging. We were planning a sort of 10-minute discussion on this, but really we have run out of time. Poppy, would you like to just give us a kind of very quick summary snapshot of where we're going with transmission charging, what the plans are or not, or no plans?
It's me. Sorry, did you say Poppy?
Poppy, yeah.
Yes. So the final thing that I think was mentioned is that as part of this review, they want to try and have charges that are a little bit more reflective of the location. So if you're in a really high cost area or a low cost area, it's tricky because there are equity issues with that. But essentially, one of the decisions they have made, which Peter's mentioned, they haven't made a decision about DUOS, the distribution transmission costs, but they have made a decision about transmission, we think. So the transmission costs that currently don't get applied to generation schemes under 100 megawatt size, they will in the future start to pay transmission costs. So they will start to pay to NUOS at some point in the future. So there's 2 big things to note with that. Firstly, that at the moment, transmission costs are a cost in Scotland, but could well be a credit in the rest of England. So this is actually terrible news for small Scottish generators, but could be positive news for small generators in closer to demand, I guess, in England. So that's just to note. So we say charges, but it could be a credit. But because of that issue, they have held back on doing this because I think it is very likely the method that they calculate to NUOS. So the reason that it's really high in Scotland and a credit in the south. So that's going to be reviewed over, I'd imagine, the next couple of years. So this is really just a flag that that's going to apply, but we don't know how much it will be. It'll probably be negative for Scottish generators and maybe positive or less negative for other small generators in England. And hopefully, but one of the things is hopefully when that is applied, the requirement to pay for transmission reinforcement that we currently and still have for really big schemes, that might go. But this is to be confirmed.
Brilliant. Thanks, Poppy. So that brings us nicely up to our intended finish time. We're going to wrap it up there, and if you have further questions about this topic or things you'd like to discuss, then we will send out contact details for Northern Powergrid in the email to follow this up with all of the slides and the recording, so that, and that will be going online as well, so that anyone who's missed this can get up to speed on this topic. Time-wise, you know, this consultation closes next Wednesday. We'd urge you and encourage you to respond to that directly. We will put in a submission on behalf of you, on behalf of this sector as well, because we've had lots of feedback over the years about those connection charges. Particularly, it's interesting to see in the feedback, that's the bit that you found the most useful from today. But that leaves me really to wrap up and thank everyone. Peter, Gavin, any final words from Northern Powergrid?
Not from me, thank you. Just thanks to everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, just as always, say thank you very much for your participation. It's very much valued and appreciated. And as has been said, anything you guys need, please do follow up with us. Please do feed your comments back in. It does make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Peter and Poppy for expertly guiding us through some really, really complex issues. Really well done to you guys. thank you also to Kai, who spends an enormous amount of time and energy putting all of this together and making sure everything runs smoothly and that the tech works. So thank you to Kai, and thank you to Northern Powergrid as well, because without their funding of this work, we wouldn't be able to talk to you about these issues and help you hopefully help you understand them better. As a reminder, this is an absolutely crucial time to influence what happens with our energy network, how we pay for that system in the future, and really how that's going to impact our low carbon transition and getting to net zero, where we're all aiming for that. So absolutely encourage you to respond, send us your examples, as I've said, and we really look forward to seeing you again soon. We have another forum with Northern Powergrid. It's our general community energy forum on the 16th of September. We'll send you the links for that as well, and we really hope that you'll be able to join us then. But thank you so much for your participation today, and all of your comments and questions really helps us to get a sense of what your understanding of this is and what you need as well to enable you to take a big role in that future energy transition that we want to see for all of us to be able to get to low carbon or no carbon. Thanks very much. Nice to see you all. Bye.